what could be more imagination than Willy Wonka? Here's a song by Bill.
Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look, and you'll see into your imagination. We'll begin with a spin, traveling in the world of my creation. What we'll see will defy explanation. If you want to view paradise, simply look around and do it. Anything you want to do it. Want to change the world, there's nothing to it. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. Living there, you'll be free if you truly wish to be. If you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it. Anything you want to do it. Want to change the world, there's nothing to it. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. Living there, you'll be free if you truly wish to be.
All right, that's Bill Brooks. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill and Kent and Todd. Yes, we are so blessed. How many of you would like to live in a world of your imagination? The world that you hold in your highest dreams and hopes. It all starts with imagination, which is our power for the month. For those of you who may be somewhat new to this and may not be aware of what the 12 powers are, the 12 powers are gifts from God that we are endowed with, that we have to use to grow. And Charles Fillmore, our co-founder, believed that once we gather our 12 powers together and develop them, we rise to the same place in consciousness that Jesus the Christ was. He gathered his 12 disciples together. And once he had gathered them, he began his work. It's a very powerful symbol for us. Gather our tools, gather our gifts, and then go to work. So these powers reflect God's nature within us. They are our own divine nature, waiting to be developed. And as we affirm their presence, as we focus on them, as we work with them, we manifest them, we bring them forth into expression in both the spiritual and the physical. As with all creation, These powers or ideas exist in divine mind. And if we are indeed one with God, which is what we believe, am I right? Yeah, good. You're paying attention. If we are truly one with God, and God is not only in us, but as us, then those 12 powers reside in each one of us as well. Not bound by religion or anything else, any other barrier that humanity creates. It's in everybody. And so we have these attributes, these abilities to call them forth into expression and create our world. But we cannot create effectively and completely unless we use them all, unless we develop them all. So this year, we have been going through our 12 powers, learning what they are, and making a slight change for those of you who are not aware. When Charles Fillmore first wrote the book, The 12 Powers of Man, and then later on, The 12 Powers, he assigned each one of the powers to a specific disciple. Not that that disciple was like in charge of the power, but that disciple represented the powers. And of course, they were the 12 apostles of Jesus. That was many years ago, 100 years ago. Things have changed. And one of the things that we have realized, that I have realized, is that we have been a patriarchal race. I got an uh-huh? Yes. For 4,000 years at least. And it's time to bring the divine feminine back in. So, yeah. Yes. We have it in all of us. And we really need the balance. And it's time to energize the divine feminine power in each and every one of us. So what we are doing this year is assigning a female figure from the sacred scriptures to represent each one of the 12 powers. This month, our power is imagination. Charles assigned the power of imagination to be represented by the Apostle Bartholomew. And of course, the power center for imagination is right between the eyes. But we are going to assign a female figure to it. And the figure I chose is a woman named Abigail. Some people, how many of you know who Abigail was? Only a few. Yeah, good. I can make this up as I go along. No, I will tell you the truth, as much as we know. The story of Abigail is found in 1 Samuel 25. Abigail was a woman who lived in a tribe outside of Jerusalem. And it was the time of David. And David had grown to a point where he was on the outs with Saul. If you remember your Bible history, Saul was the king. David was his favorite person, was going to succeed him. He did eventually, but not under the way Saul thought he would. And Saul had been a good king, but he kind of went nuts. And David was actually leading a revolt against Saul. And he was being chased through the desert, him and his army, by Saul's armies. And he managed to evade them until he came to this place where David's army was starving. They were out of water, they were out of supplies, they were desperate. They were in the wilderness west of the Dead Sea, near a large area of land controlled by a tribal leader named Nabal, where he raised sheep and goats. He was very powerful. And knowing that he was in the area, David sent some of his men to greet Nabal and to ask for provisions. So these men approached Nabal in his camp in his village, and they wished him good wishes and peace. And then they also shared with them that, by the way, one of your shepherds and flocks were being attacked by raiders, and we defended them, and they are safe. And by the way, could you give us some food and water? Nabal was not the nicest guy, let's just say. He was known for being very cantankerous, being very surly. And he said, "Who are you that I should support you? Who are you? Who is David, the son of Jesse? What is he to me? I'm not going to share any of my supplies with him." Well, the men went back and they told David what had happened. And David said, "Okay, no problem, we'll take it." And he marched his army towards Nabal's camp. But there was a woman in the camp who was betrothed to Nabal, a woman who was known to be very intelligent. Her name was Abigail. And when she learned of this, she used her power of imagination. All the logic in the world said, pick up your swords, pick up your spears, get your bows and arrows, we're going to war, because that's what we do. But she said, no, there's got to be a higher way, a better way. She used her power of imagination, and she gathered up food and water and all the supplies herself, and she took them out to David's army as they were coming towards them. She brought them wine, grain, prepared meat, and cakes of fig. And then she fell down in front of David, pleading with him to show mercy. You see, even though she understood Nabal's character, she was able to imagine a different outcome. And she said to David, please pay no attention to my lord. He is a wicked man. He is just like his name, for his name means fool and folly, and that always goes before him. She was under no illusions about who this guy was. Well, David thanked her and accepted the gifts of food and water and regretted his own foolish and rash decision and turned his army around. And he sends Abigail home in peace. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Nabal, oblivious to his misconduct and the danger that he has been in, has a big feast and gets very drunk. And Abigail waits until the next morning to tell him that David had been on his way to destroy them and how she had intervened. And I like this part. Upon hearing the news, Nabal has a heart attack and dies. And when David hears of Nabal's death, he sends a message to Abigail asking her to become his wife, and she agrees. Well, David had his problems too. He wasn't perfect either. But anyway, that's the story. So who was Abigail? Well, Abigail was, as far as we know, one of the very first Carmelites. How many of you ever heard of a Carmelite nun? Well, Carmelites were an order that predates Catholicism, predates Christianity, and even predates what would eventually be the religion called Judaism. It is believed that it was founded on the teachings of Elijah and Elisha. And they lived on Mount Carmel, where the caves that the prophets of old had lived in. And so they were called Carmelites. It was men and women. They held equal status in those days. So she is from this sect, and her wisdom and her action saved her people and probably many of David's people from death and destruction. She was very wise. But being wise in and of itself is not always sufficient. We have to learn what to do with that wisdom. The wisdom of the day, and sadly, too often, the wisdom of nowadays, is when somebody is threatening you, you strike first and you strike hard. When somebody doesn't give you what you want, you take it. But imagination calls to us, just like it did to Abigail, to open ourselves up to other possibilities. Abigail knew in her wisdom that the effects of an attack would be devastating for all of them. But she also knew that if the needs of David and his army were met, there would be no conflict. And she used her imagination. She painted a picture in her head first, an image. That's where the word imagination comes from. An image of a different outcome, a different action. She realized something that I think all of us in our world today need to realize. Conflict always arises out of needs not met. Always. Not just armed conflict, but many of the other conflicts we see today in our politics, in our relationships, in things that are political issues but shouldn't be political issues at all. They should be human condition issues. The big one on our minds right now is gun violence. What does it arise out of? There are those who say we need guns, arising out of a fear of having people try to take stuff from us. And there are those who say we don't need guns, arising out of a fear of being killed. Homelessness arises out of needs not being met. And those who have a consciousness of, well, you deserve it because God doesn't like you for some reason, arises out of a fear of what they have being taken away. War is almost always a lack of abundance consciousness. The list goes on and on and on. Every conflict we face arises out of needs not being met. But just like Abigail, we have the power of imagination. We can draw on it, and we can imagine different ways of meeting different needs. And the same holds true for ourselves. When we are in a conflict, in a relationship, or even within our own consciousness, it's because some part of our need is not being met. And imagination is the key we use. It doesn't always provide the answer, but it provides possibilities. And everything begins with a possibility, an image of a different outcome. All creation, whether from the mind of God or the mind of humans, begins with an image. The story of creation in Genesis is told twice. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The first one is in God's imagination. It's the picture being painted of what is going to be created. And then it is brought forth into manifestation. Creation for us works the same way. It begins with imagination. As I was writing this talk, I began with an image of what I wanted to say. As Bill and Todd and Kent create music, they begin with an image of what they want to do. As any of us create anything, from the food we're going to eat during potluck, to this podium, to our computers and our phones and all of the things that we use, all began with an image in somebody's head. And it is through our imagination that formlessness takes form. Where do the ideas come from? We all know they first come from divine mind, from God mind. They're projected into our consciousness from God and then given shape and given texture by our own minds and then projected into manifestation. There is no thought that can be thought within the mind that cannot be manifested as a tangible thing. Hear that again because it's important. There is no thought that can be thought within the mind that cannot be manifested as a tangible thing. Anything you can think of, anything you can imagine, you can manifest. Even the big stuff. Yes, sometimes we start with little steps working towards it. Let me give you some examples from modern life. Think about science fiction. How many of you like science fiction? I grew up reading Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke, and of course, I am a Trekkie. Think about Gene Roddenberry. He had an idea of a disc with information encoded upon it using light. And approximately, I believe, 15 to 20 years later, we had CDs and DVDs. They had the communicators. And what did we have a few years later? Communicators. We call them cell phones. Even beaming people across space is now not people, but is happening on an atomic level in laboratories. There is nothing that we can image that cannot be manifest. Jules Verne held an image, not just of going to the moon. That image had been around for a long time, but he created an image of how to do it. And it was less than 100 years later that we walked on the moon. Nor is our imagination limited to science. The Buddha imagined a world where there was not attachment to things. The Christ, Jesus, imagined a world where grounded in love and peace and soul growth. Gandhi imagined a way to gain independence for an entire nation without going to war? What if we used our imagination the same way? What if we decided to imagine a world of peace? You know, if enough of us do it and really give it our energy, it will happen. What if we really believed and imagined a world where everybody's needs were met? We call that the abundant life for everybody. Would we not have that? After all, we are created in the image and likeness of God. And all humans are created in this image. This was the message of every great teacher the world has ever known. And it was the lesson of Abigail. God mind is unlimited in ideas. Every answer to every problem already exists in God mind. We can use our power of imagination to draw those into our own mind, to give it form, and then to begin to manifest it. So I'm going to ask you, what can you imagine? What can you imagine? Can you imagine yourself perfectly healthy and whole? Can you imagine having your needs met? Can you imagine having great relationships? Because that's where it starts. You know, one of the biggest problems we have today is we have all of these influencers around us. The media, social media, politics, all of that is telling us, you can't. This is not possible. There's not enough of whatever resource. But our imagination comes from divine mind, which says there is more than enough of everything you need to have the life for yourself, your loved ones, and everybody else. Every answer to every problem already exists in divine mind. Let's expand it out a little bit. We're going to have our town hall today. We've done a lot this year, folks. You're going to hear some good things. But what can you imagine for Unity Spiritual Center Albuquerque? Can you imagine a place that is focused and dedicated to individual soul growth, to spiritual community for all people, to evolution? That's the image I hold. Can you hold that image? Thought I put you all to sleep. Can you imagine a world of peace? Yes. Can you imagine a world where nobody lives on the street hungry? Yes. Can you imagine a world where love in all of its manifestations is embraced and accepted? Yes. Can you imagine a world where people put down their guns and say, no more? Yes. If you can imagine it, if you can create and hold that image in your consciousness, you can give that image your attention, and you can help bring it forward into manifestation. And the steps you need to take will be shown as you move. But it all starts with what we imagine. Albert Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress and giving birth to evolution. Carl Sagan, imagination will carry us to worlds that never were, but without it, we go nowhere. What are you holding in your imagination? Are you imagining living in fear and anxiety? Or are you imagining infinite possibility? Because when we can do that, when we can master our imagination, we become the artists. And imagination determines our lives. And when enough people do that together, when everyone's imagination rises to a higher vibration, our evolution changes. I'm going to close with a quote from the Messiah's Handbook. The Messiah's Handbook was written by Richard Bach, taking quotes and stuff from various books of his others. But this one has always been one of my favorites. Imagine the universe, beautiful and just and perfect. And then be sure of one thing, that God has imagined it far better than you have. The only original sin is to limit God. Don't do it. Namaste.
All right, Bill has a great song for us.
To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary, to reach the unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know if I'll only be true to this glorious quest, that my heart will lie peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. And the world will be better for this, that one man scorned and covered in scars still strove with his last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable star.
Thank you, Bill. That's great.